So, welcome everybody to the official launch of the Swiss chapter of Giving What We Can. And I'm really happy that you all chose to come here in the sunny weather to witness our first baby steps and to join in something that I actually think has the potential to change the lives of a tremendous number of people. So my name is Helene Andrebe. I'm a PhD student here at ETH. I've been a member of Giving What We Can for about a year now. And when I first went to a Giving What We Can talk back in Oxford, what I found absolutely striking was the clarity it gave to my view of the world. So I felt like an ostrich who'd spent her entire life with its head stuck in the sand and then had it lifted out and could see for the first time how the other 7 billion ostriches in the world live. And we have a very full program for you guys today, so without further ado, I would like to welcome my colleague Lucas Gore to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Elena. I'm very happy that I can now introduce such a renowned speaker for our launch event. Giving What We Can is about combating world poverty, and Thomas Pogge is a leading expert on this very topic. He is the Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs at Yale University. He did his PhD at Harvard, where his dissertation was supervised by no other than John Rawls. He has published widely on political philosophy, world poverty, and global justice. But he doesn't just write about these issues, he's also actively involved in projects that focus on helping the poor. A recent example of that is his contributions to the Health Impact Fund. That's an initiative that would provide incentives for pharmaceutical companies to focus on health impact and not just on reaching a lot of people with a lot of money to sell all the medicine. Thomas Pogge is also an official member of the international Giving What We Can community. I'm looking forward to his talk. Please help me welcome Professor Thomas Pogge.
So I'll start you off with a few facts and figures about the poverty problem so that you see what we are talking about here. I think I do this. So I'll start you off, sorry for the technical glitch, I'll start you off with a few facts and figures about the global poverty problem. And as you know, the world population now is roughly 7 billion people, and of those 7 billion, very large numbers are still suffering from very severe deprivations that are poverty related, such as having not enough to eat chronically, meaning every day of the week, every week of the year, having no access to essential medical care, having no access to drinking water, lack of adequate shelter, electricity, lack of adequate sanitation, illiteracy, and then there's a large number of children who are working at early ages outside their own household. Now, these numbers are shocking enough, but in one sense they understate the magnitude of the problem, and the reason for that is that because they are a snapshot representation of the world, what is happening at one moment in time, they understate the lives of those people whose lives are short and overrepresent the lives of those people whose lives are long. And so if you look at this, this is not actual data because I don't have the actual data, but this is roughly the life expectancy in the various quintiles of the world's population, in the various fifth of the world population. And if you assume that the people in the bottom fifth live much shorter than people in the other fifths, then you find that fully a third of all human lives are lived in the bottom fifth of the human population. It sounds paradoxical, but it's nevertheless quite true. Now the next statistic is one that doesn't make that mistake, that really gives equal weight, equal consideration to every human life. It simply looks at how people die. And so 57 million people die every year, roughly, and of those, fully 18 million die from poverty-related causes. And you can see here what these causes are. I've estimated this very conservatively, counting only those causes of death that are basically unknown in the richer countries. Of course, poor people also die from the same things we die from, and often much earlier than we do because they have greater risks in the environment or worse medical care. But I've not counted any of those deaths. I've only counted those causes of death that are essentially non-existent in the richer countries. And even that already sums to 18 million deaths, a third of all human deaths. Now, if you put that in perspective, you find that since the end of the Cold War in 1990, about 400 million people have died from poverty-related causes, and you can see here that dwarfs all the deaths from government-sponsored violence in the entire 20th century. So all the wars, all the civil wars, all the gulags, all the concentration camps, all of that together caused about 200 million deaths, whereas poverty caused twice as many in just 20 years. So a much, much greater killer than government-sponsored violence. Now that obviously leads us to think about human rights. We are committed officially to the human right. Everybody has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. And yet we find that a very large number of people, probably more than half, do not have this human right fulfilled. This is by far the most widely underfulfilled, the most widely unrealized human right in the world. Why is it happening? Why do we still have such a very large number of people living in such extreme poverty? A very superficial answer is it has to do with the world income distribution. So I'm showing you here how all the income in the world that goes to households is distributed. This here is the top 5% of the human population. They have a little over 46% of global household income. This is the next 20%. They have about the same. So now we already have more than 90% of global household income spoken for, and we've just looked at the top quarter. This is the second quarter, the third, and for those of you with good eyes, this is the fourth quarter. Well under 1%, in fact about 0.75% of global household income goes to the bottom quarter of the world's population. I have here a nice little break in case you have any questions, comments at this point, or should I just march on? Do you know who all these people are? Who knows the woman? Mary Wollstonecraft. Who knows the man on the right? Everybody, good. My thesis advisor is this guy, and that's Amartya Sen. Anyway, on we go then. So what I think is a very big part of the story of inequality is regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is a very simple phenomenon. You have rules of the game, rules within Switzerland, rules in the world economy, and these rules have distributive effects. They influence how well particular people are doing, particular groups of people are doing in an economic system, any kind of competitive system. Now everybody understands that. It's not a secret. And so people take an interest in the rules. It's called lobbying. People lobby. They try to influence the rules in their own favor in order to get a larger share of the pie that we together produce. And in this game of lobbying, the strongest participants have an advantage. They have greater incentives to lobby and also greater opportunities to lobby. Greater opportunities because a few of them can achieve a political result. In order to be effective, you need maybe 20, 30 hedge fund managers in New York, and they have enough muscle really to influence what goes on in the US Congress or what the US president decides to do. If teachers wanted to do the same thing, you'd need about 500,000 teachers, 600,000 teachers in order to have the same influence, to spend the same kind of money on campaign contributions, for example. So it's much, much harder to organize. And also, people who are much richer than others have much stronger incentives because for them it's really worth it. Right? If the law changed in my favor so that I paid a little bit less in taxes, I would save maybe a few $1,000s. A hedge fund manager might save a few $1 million. And so it's much more worth their while to spend time and intelligence on trying to influence the rules. This then leads to inequality spirals. In each round of legislative reform, each time, those who are already the most advantaged participants have better opportunities to influence the rules in their own favor. Their doing that means they secure an even larger share of the collectively produced product, and that in turn makes them even more able and more incentivized in the next round to lobby again for even more favorable rules. So there's a spiral which over time leads to a pretty heavy increase in inequality. So that's the explanation that I want to offer you as one very important element in explaining why inequality has become so large. Now, this explanation would suggest that the most cost-effective lobbying can be done at the supranational level, for the simple reason that at the supranational level we don't have much of a democratic counterweight. International treaties are not made democratically. In fact, they're not even made in a way that is transparent, where we know what is being negotiated, who is arguing for what. We know that when the parliament meets. We don't know that when governments are negotiating treaties. There's no accountability, no transparency, and even afterwards, when the treaty text has been published, it's not possible to find out who pushed for what article, how certain language got into the treaty text. All of that is shrouded in secrecy. The only thing that gets published is the final treaty text. That environment is the ideal environment for lobbyists. Lobbyists can here exert their influence unobserved, without any accountability. Nobody knows whom they lobbied, how they lobbied, and so it's a very effective way of lobbying for banks, for big industry associations, big corporations, and of course very rich individuals. So all these very privileged agents have an interest in rules being shifted upward from the national level, where we have transparency, accountability, and democracy, at least in many important countries, to the supranational level, where all of that is absent. And they also, of course, have an interest to manipulate the rules in their own favor. That's happened massively in the last 20 years, which were the years of globalization, where this big shift has taken place. More and more of the rules that dominate our economies, that dominate our day-to-day interactions, are shaped now at the supranational level and no longer at the national level, where at most implementing activities take place, where national parliaments get to implement what was decided at the supranational level. Now, lobbying is done, as I said, by the very wealthiest banks, corporations, associations, and so on. And whom do you lobby? Where is the softest target? It's clearly the US government. The US government is special in two ways. On the one hand, because it's still the most powerful, the most influential agent in supranational negotiations. And secondly, because politics is nowhere more for sale than in the US. You see it now in the election campaign. We have a wonderful system in the US, $1 but one vote. Officially, of course, it's one person, one vote. But money plays an enormous role in politics. A US election costs about $6 billion as opposed to about 50 million for a British election. And enormous amounts of money are spent on campaigns. It's all privately funded. And of course, if you give money to a candidate, be it a senatorial or congressperson, president, one of the super PACs that is supporting candidates, of course you expect something in return. Politicians render favors to those who pay the money. Now, if this story were true, if lobbying and regulatory capture really played a big role, you would expect then the greatest beneficiaries of the increasing inequality to be the top people in the United States. And that is what you actually find in this crucial globalization period, that the income share in the United States of the poorest half of the population has dropped by more than 50%, while the income share of the rich has increased dramatically. And it's the very rich, it's the very top that gains. The pivot point is about at the 92% mark. You see here the increase for the top 1% was about 2.6-fold, for the top 0.1%, 4.6-fold, and for the top 100% 7-fold. So a tremendous increase since 1978. Many of you have taken economics classes. If you've taken any simple class, you've heard about the Kuznets curve. The Kuznets curve predicts that as a country develops, inequality goes up, and then it goes back down. That's exactly what happened in the United States until 1978. Since then, inequality has exploded and has surpassed its peak, which was in 1928. Now, the top 1% of US taxpayers, that's 14,400 tax returns, 30,000 people in the households. It's a very small group. And this group now has half as much income as the bottom half of Americans, 156 million people. And this small little group has 2/3 as much income as the bottom half of humanity, which is 3.5 billion people. So the inequality really is quite spectacular. Now, what are some of the rules at the global level, at the supranational level, that are important for explaining increasing inequality? What are the kinds of rules that have been fixed in favor of the rich? I won't go through these in great detail, but there are the hangover protectionisms, where rich countries protect their markets against imports from the poor countries. Switzerland, for example, has protections in agriculture that are quite significant, that on the one hand make it harder for poor countries to import food into Switzerland, and on the other hand also make it easier for Swiss exports to compete in world markets. Pollution rules, well, the rich countries are responsible for the large majority of pollution, whereas the poor countries get to suffer the majority of the consequences. There are the 4 privileges, according to which we recognize any person or group effectively ruling a country as entitled to sell the resources of the country and to borrow money in the name of the whole country, even if that person or group came to power through a coup d'etat, and even if that person or group doesn't govern in the interest of the country at all. So the Mobutu Sese Sekos and Sani Abachas and Obiangs of this world are happily selling the resources of their countries and borrowing in the name of the people of the country, even though they are hated by the population and govern merely by force. The arms trade, another obvious problem, does enormous damage in the developing world, while the richer countries are the main arms exporters and benefit from that trade. For Switzerland, the most important thing, of course, is illicit financial flows, which I've left for last, and you can see that on the next slide. The less developed countries have about $1 trillion, that's $1,000 billion, in illicit financial outflows each year, which consists of embezzlement, of tax evasion, of trade mispricing, and various other phenomena. So all this money is flowing out of the developing world into tax havens, of which Switzerland is the most important. This $1 trillion, by the way, is about 10 times as much money as all the development assistance that we send into those countries from all sources. Private wealth consists in the moment of about $230 trillion. That's what all private individuals together own. And about 10% of that is held offshore. So it's kept away from the tax authorities. Nobody knows who owns that money. Nobody pays any taxes on the income from that money. And about 30 to 40% of that offshore money is held in just one country. Guess which one? Yours, Switzerland. In the less developed countries, almost half of all privately held wealth is held abroad. Poor countries have low enforcement capabilities, low administrative capabilities, and of course if they ask Switzerland to give them any information about people who may have holdings in Switzerland, the answer is no. The Swiss are very strongly pushing for a system where there would be source taxation, where some money would be withheld in Switzerland, but no information would be exchanged with foreign tax authorities. But the Swiss are willing to do that only for countries that can really exert pressure on Switzerland, Germany and Britain in particular. They're not willing to do that for developing countries. So one thing you could do is see whether you can't get your fellow citizens to agree that what Switzerland is willing to do, namely some source withholding for Germany and Britain, it would also be willing to do for the least developed countries and the lower middle income countries like India. That would be a tremendous gain for those countries because, as I said, 40% of the wealth of their citizens is held offshore and no taxes are paid on capital gains, interest, dividends that are paid on that money. Now, how has income, global income, developed over the 17 years between 1988 and 2005? I will see whether I can make this work. This is basically the same information that I showed you earlier in the pie chart. This is today, and this is 17 years ago. So I hope you can sort of see the development. What happened basically is the top 5% gained, everybody else lost, and the bottom quarter, barely visible on the right bottom here, had the greatest losses. The bottom quarter lost about 1/3 of its already very meager share of global household income. They went down from 1.16% to 0.78% of global household income. And that is the answer to the question, why do we still have so much deprivation, so much poverty? The answer is that the gains that were made in average income in the world, average income goes up, were overwhelmed by the losses in the relative share of the poor. The poor benefit from the fact that the pie is getting bigger, but they are harmed by the fact that the slice that they get becomes thinner and thinner. So to summarize the key facts, first, in these 17 years, from 88 to 05, the richest 5% have gained 3.5% of global household income, which is more than the bottom half had left at the end of that period. The ratio of average incomes in the top 5% versus the bottom quarter has risen from 185 to 1 up to 297 to 1. If the poorer half had merely just maintained its income share, they would now be 21% higher than they are, and the poorest quarter would even be 49% above where they are now, if they had merely just kept their measly share of global household income. And finally, if the bottom half had made the gain that in fact went to the top 5%, namely that 3.5% of global household income, then they would have doubled their share to 7%, and poverty would already be history now. So things have very much moved in the wrong direction. My generation has been a very big failure as far as poverty eradication is concerned. So I have another break in case there are any questions. You should probably just ask clarification questions if there are any, and otherwise I'll go on and we have the discussion at the end. Now this guy? Okay.
So you said it would help the underdeveloped countries, Switzerland, would show where the taxes go. So how bad would that be for Switzerland?
It would be pretty bad for Switzerland. In the sense, huh?
Do you have arguments?
Yeah, I mean, a very good chunk of your federal budget comes from, tax revenues from banks and so on. The fact that so many people park their money here helps your economy greatly. Many Swiss believe that you are rich because you make wonderful cuckoo's clocks and great chocolate and maybe watches, but you do, of course, and they are wonderful and you deserve to be exporting them, but the real big money does not come from cuckoo's clocks. It would hurt. It would make a difference to your economy, and that's why there is this very, very big pushback, right? There has been an initiative spearheaded by Britain, the US, and Germany saying we have to do information exchange. We have a global economic crisis. We have to look for new sources of revenue. So let us all exchange information and help each other to catch the tax cheats in our respective countries. And Switzerland is the country that said, no, this is a terrible idea. We have to maintain bank secrecy, but we have a better idea. Let's do it differently. Let's tax at the source. And so Switzerland, with the help of some other countries, was successful in basically derailing this information exchange idea and defending the principle of bank secrecy, which is basically bank secrecy is just another name for tax evasion. Yeah, so I'm supposed to tell the Swiss people that this would be good for them to change it. I can't. It wouldn't be true. It would be bad for you to change it. I mean, you are benefiting from injustice. And if you want to continue benefiting from injustice, be my guest. But I cannot tell you that in this particular case, the right and the good are coincident. They aren't. It will hurt. It will mean that you will have to finance more of your budget from other sources of income, it will mean that maybe your budget will be smaller, you'll be a little less rich. But it also means that many children in developing countries will have health care, education, food, shelter, clothing, which they now don't have because such enormous amounts of money are flowing into secret bank accounts, are being embezzled. So what can I say? Any other? Yes?
Sorry, I was just recently reading a book on tax havens. Oh, sorry. Does that help? I was recently reading a book on tax havens, and I think, of course, it's essential to emphasize Switzerland's problematic role. But from what I read, and I don't know if this is true, and you want to comment on it, the US and the UK are two of the biggest of the tax havens as well, and they also have all sorts of secrecy laws and laws in place as well.
Yes, they do. They do, and there was an article in The Economist just last week, September 27 edition, where a bunch of decoys went into various banks in many different countries, and they looked pretty suspicious. You know, one was representing a mafia guy, one was representing a Russian tycoon, and some were representing terrorists, and they sort of walked in with large bags of money and wanted to deposit. And how many times did they need to try it in order to find a bank willing to take the money? And actually the UK and the US were near the top of the list in terms of making it easy. It's quite, you know, sure, we take your money. And so, yes, I'm not saying that others are blameless. I'm just saying that Switzerland is a very large part of the problem. And the Swiss banks have now, I mean, before this agreement with Germany and the UK takes effect, actually the Swiss banks have given all their secret customers the opportunity to shift their money out. And without paying, they have to pay a penalty tax if they keep their money here for past tax evasion. But if they move it out, there's no penalty. And you can stay with the same bank. You just go from the USB Swiss branch to the USB Singapore branch or whatever. And that's all you need to do in order to escape. So, but you're right. And of course, the argument is one that's often made. I call it the sucker exemption, where people say, look, yes, what I'm doing is wrong, and I would be very happy if nobody did it. But given the fact that all these other guys are also doing it, I don't want to be the sucker. I don't want to be the dumb guy who is improving their act while everybody else is continuing to do the bad thing. And of course, guess what the Americans and the Brits are saying, right? They're saying that the Swiss are doing this, and so we don't want to be the sucker either. Who is suffering? Well, it's the people in the developing world. So it's a little bit like, if I can use a feminist metaphor, if men are beating their wives, right? And everybody's saying, well, others are doing it, so you don't ask me to stop. The problem with the argument is that it's not that people are, you want to say that you're not...
I didn't mean it as an argument.
Okay, I just want to, for those who attempted to think of this as an argument, I just want to say that when the people who are suffering are third parties, it is a particularly bad argument. Right? Lying to the liars is one thing. Cheating the cheaters is one thing. But beating up on third parties just because others are also beating up on third parties, and the same third parties to boot, is quite a different thing altogether. Good, so let's look for a moment at how the world responds to this catastrophe of poverty. There was a World Food Summit in Rome in 1996 where all the governments of the world pretty much came together, and they promised that they would halve the number of chronically undernourished people by 2015. You can see here the text that was printed in the summit declaration. We'll halve it over 19 years, between now and 2015. Now, at that time, the number of chronically undernourished was 788 million. So 50% of that is 394 million. And look what happened. What happened is that the number actually bottomed in 1996. It never went any lower than 788 million, and it went up ever since, crossing the 1 billion mark for the first time in all of human history in the year 2009. I hope you all noticed that when that happened. It wasn't widely reported in the press, but it did happen. So the number of chronically undernourished went up and up. Now, what happened with our governments? What happened to the promise that we were supposed to halve that number? Well, this is not the right slide, I think. Yeah, that's right. It is the right slide, sorry. So it went to 925. That's the last recorded number for 2010. And that means instead of making a 50% progress, we made a 17% regress. We moved in the wrong direction. Now, what our governments did is they adopted the first Millennium Development Goal, one of the targets of which has exactly the same subject matter. Namely, we will still have chronic undernutrition by 2015, so that's remained the same. But we now mean something different by that promise. We mean by this promise that we have the proportion of chronically undernourished people, and we use the new baseline of 1990 rather than 1996. Now, when you halve a proportion, that means you are halving a ratio, and you can halve a ratio either by halving what's in the denominator, the Zähler, or you can double what's in the denominator, what is that called? The Nenner in German. Okay, so since population increases rather rapidly in the developing countries, much of the work of halving chronic undernutrition is already done by population increase. And so this reformulation of the goal makes the goal much, much less ambitious. The old goal of Rome envisaged a 3.58% annual reduction in the number of chronically undernourished. The new goal envisages a 1.37% annual reduction. Here's the text, MDG, number 1, second target, half the proportion of people undernourished. Now here you get a better looking result, right? 843 million was the number in 1990. This was the LDC population in the same year. 0.19 is the proportion. You halve that proportion, and you get a new target of 596 million chronically undernourished people. So as you can see here, about 202 million chronically undernourished people were added to the list of those whose chronic undernutrition in the year 2015 will be deemed morally acceptable, will be celebrated as a success. And suddenly, we've made a little progress at least, 17% progress towards the goal, because we are now measuring it as a proportion. Here's the same thing again. If you don't like numbers, you like graphs perhaps. So the glide path that was promised in Rome is the red line here. The glide path that is promised by MDG 1, the first Millennium Development Goal, is the blue glide path, a much less ambitious undertaking. The same thing was done also for extreme poverty, where we moved from the green glide path to the blue glide path, a much less ambitious undertaking. This is just a little joke. Kofi Annan, in his first report about how we are doing with regard to the Millennium Development Goals, could announce in the year 2002 that we actually have fulfilled the extreme poverty goal in East Asia and the Pacific, the world's most populous region, already in 1999, one full year before the goal was announced. It was announced in the year 2000. So that's pretty fun. And you achieve that simply by backdating the baseline to 1990 and then saying, well, in East Asia and the Pacific, we are already down from 28% to 14%. So now let's see who we get here. Who knows who this is? Any points on the MDGs?
Apart from these goals, wasn't the actual goal of the MDG to bridge the gap within the development community and to be able to channel money and to actually get more money into development work, not even regarding the goal itself? I mean, what you said is correct. The question is, what impact did the MDGs have?
Yeah, and that's hard to estimate because you don't know what would have happened otherwise, right? What impact relative to what? Now, you might say having the MDGs is better than having no MDGs at all, nothing like it. And I would agree with you that that is true. But I also think that the MDGs were very ill-conceived. On the one hand, because of this deceit that they reduced the goals that had been adopted with great fanfare in the 1990s. But the most important thing, and this goes to the heart of what you said about galvanizing and trying to mobilize and so on, the problem with the MDGs was that they were not really goals at all. A goal is something that is attached to a particular agent. It's a particular agent's goal, and that agent then undertakes something called trying to reach that goal. Now, the MDGs were basically wishful thoughts. It would be nice if poverty were halved. It would be nice if hunger were halved. But no agent was given any specific responsibility to do anything in particular towards achieving that goal. And so quite predictably, the rich countries became bystanders, and they were looking at this like a horse race. Cameroon does seem to be doing all right. Nigeria is falling behind, and so on. And the poor countries were saying, well, what are the rich countries doing? Aren't they helping us? And so on. Of course, development aid continued to flow, but the total amount of development aid is ridiculously low, continued to be ridiculously low. I mean, certainly inadequate to achieve any major inroads against poverty, especially since only about 1/8 of all development assistance is devoted to basic social services. Most of it really doesn't even go to projects that benefit the poor. So you're right that having the MDGs was certainly better than having nothing at all, but I would still say that we could have done much, much better in setting more ambitious goals, and more importantly in setting goals that would assign a real responsibility to concrete agents such as rich country governments to do something concrete in the event that we come off the glide path, that we fall short of achieving the progress that we were committed to achieving. I go on? So what we need to do forward going, I think, is to move from these pseudo goals of the MDGs that are detached from any particular agent to concrete responsibilities, agreed responsibilities where particular agents take on particular tasks, and if these tasks don't progress in the way that they are promised to progress, well, then these particular agents have to do more in agreed dimensions in order to make sure that we get back onto the path. Now, development assistance is the preferred way in which we tackle the problem of poverty, or rather fail to tackle it. But official development assistance is clearly insufficient, both in terms of the amount and also in how it is being spent. You can see here again what I already said. Only $15 billion are spent on basic social services. $120 billion are spent on development assistance altogether. And I already told you that outflows into illicit financial flows alone are $1 trillion that flow out each year from the poor countries. Subsidies in agriculture are $250 billion worldwide, and so on and so forth. So this is just nowhere near enough, very inefficiently spent, and just won't solve the problem. A much better way forward is to mainstream the goal of poverty eradication. That is to say, don't let the lobbyists decide what the rules are at the global level, and then try to mitigate some of the damage these rules do through development assistance, but try to bring the interests of the poor to bear on what these rules are in the first place, design these rules from the very beginning with some attention to their impact on the poor. That way you need less development assistance because the headwind that these rules are blowing into the faces of the poor is much lower. So I would plead now that we are all thinking about the replacement of the MDGs in 2015, or actually this year the decisions are going to be made in the next 8 to 10 months or so. We're heavily involved in that, by the way, through a coalition of civil society organizations called Beyond 2015. So we are trying to influence that process. Think about institutional reform goals. For example, a tax on trade-distorting subventions, where the money would be spent on poverty eradication, or a tax on greenhouse gas emissions. These would be global taxes for poverty eradication. A tax on arms exports to less developed countries, again, used for poverty eradication. All these taxes, of course, would do two good things. They would discourage the behavior that is being taxed and so reduce its incidence, and they would also raise money to combat the harmful effects of that behavior. We should have an alternative minimum tax on multinational corporations on their profits, because all too often multinational corporations pay almost no taxes on their profits, because through internal trade within the company they manage to concentrate their profits in those jurisdictions where tax rates are lowest. That's often not Switzerland, but the Bahamas or countries, tax havens like that. We should end the practice of having accounts with unknown owners or beneficiaries. We already talked about that. We should allow only minimally representative rulers to undertake debt burdens in the name of the people of the whole country. And we should tax the sale of natural resources from such rulers that are not representative. And we should, this is the Health Impact Fund project, we should reward at least some of the most important medicines according to health impact, rather than by allowing the innovator to mark up the price of the product. So these are some of the most important reform goals that I think would be a much better agenda than the MDGs have been. Now let me stress two citizen responsibilities. I'm now getting to giving what we can and why that is an important initiative. We have one responsibility to work towards reform. In particular, supranational institutional arrangements that would impose less harm upon the poorer half of humankind, would blow less of a headwind into their faces. So here again, as far as I can see, one of the most important things Swiss people could do is to try to derail the Swiss government's initiative to get away from information sharing. Right? Switzerland is the big champion against information sharing. They say that a source tax is good enough, and if significant opposition in Switzerland to this idea could be mobilized, that information sharing could still come about. Second, we should compensate for our fair share of the harm that we are involved in producing. Switzerland is doing harmful things. You're all part of Switzerland, not all, but most of you. And so you're implicated in these harms. You're also beneficiaries of these harms. And so what you can do is compensate for these harms by joining an organization like Giving What We Can, by giving money to effective organizations that protect the poor from these harmful effects. And here two things are worth stressing. The first thing is that there are also opportunities to give, not just in a remedial way, compensation as I call it, but also to give of your time and energy and intelligence for political work that is almost always more risky, more difficult. It's a long shot, it may not pan out, but when it works, and sometimes it does work, its effects can be quite enormous. Secondly, you should try to help build a culture of careful giving. A lot of people, certainly in the United States, give very carelessly. They take credit for how much money they give, and they couldn't care less about how much good that money does. They measure their generosity by how much money they part with. They spend endless hours poring over mutual fund tables to find the best investment for their money. But when it comes to giving money away, they're totally careless. And I would suspect that the same is true in many European countries as well. So don't be like that. If you give money away, think about very carefully about where you give it and make sure that the money really is effective. Because if you give money to an ineffective organization that just squanders the money, wastes the money, you have not given anything at all. You have really not compensated for the harms that you're also involved in producing. So here again, it's important to give to the best organizations, even sometimes organizations that do something daring, something political that has a small chance of success, but would pay off very greatly if it did succeed. And finally, it's worth taking advantage legally of all the tax advantages that you can have. I did this morning a small little calculation about my own giving and found that by taking advantage of all the benefits of the American tax code, I can actually magnify my giving quite substantially. So in the last few years, I've given away about $180,000. I can tax deduct that money, so I can get $60,000 back. So the total I end up with by giving, as I did, is $60,000. Had I realized the capital gains, these are stocks that have appreciated a great deal in value, had I sold these stocks and put the money into my own pocket, I would have paid taxes on that, about $25,000 to $30,000. So I would have ended up with about $150,000. So I lost really net about $90,000. And so I could give away $180,000 at a real cost of only $90,000, which means that I roughly doubled the money that I gave away by doing it in an efficient, effective way. I don't know Swiss tax law, so I don't know to what extent you can do this, but it's certainly worth thinking about whether you can, through intelligent exploitation of legal loopholes, which of course were designed by the rich and for the rich, whether you can actually magnify what you can give. So I'll end here and invite discussion and questions if there's time for that.
Thank you so much, Professor Pali. I would like to invite Professor Peter Schadberg, who teaches philosophy and ethics here at the university, to lead us into further discussion.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this important event. I'd like to thank Thomas Pogge for his rich talk and also the organizers for organizing such an important event. This is not really a critical comment, as a matter of fact, because I agree with most of what Thomas Pogge says in his presentation. And in particular, I agree that we all have a moral obligation to do something to fight poverty, particularly extreme poverty. A world with so many people still living in extreme poverty, not being able to live a decent life, is morally just unacceptable. We have seen the figures which have been given to us by Thomas Pogge. So something, I agree, has to be done about that. But then let me just raise very briefly some further issues, some further questions. What exactly, the big question seems to be, should be done? What is the right way to deal with extreme poverty? Now, Thomas Pogge presents different proposals, and I cannot discuss them all here, but let me just highlight some of the proposals. First, there is the introduction of various taxes, and the idea seems to be that the money that comes from these taxes, these additional taxes, which should go, as I take it, to a human development fund or to a central institution, should actually compensate for what he says is an insufficient official development aid we have up to now. Now, there's one question I'd like to ask, but it's just a question. It seems to me difficult actually to tell what the sufficient amount of development aid would be. Probably you could say something about that in a discussion. How one can tell whether the amount of money is insufficient, whether it's the amount of money, or whether it's the problem of how the money is actually used, or whether it's the problem of how is the money used in development aid given the conditions it is used. And the conditions, I mean certain institutional conditions which have been highlighted also by Thomas Pogge. But as I said, he's talking about various taxes, for instance, tax on trade distorting subventions, tax on greenhouse emissions, tax on arms export to the least developed countries, an alternative minimum tax on multinational company profits, a tax on natural resource purchases from, as he puts it, unrepresentative rulers. And all these taxes, it is said, should be used for poverty eradication. I mean, I'm talking about 5 of his 8 measures he proposes that should be taken under the heading of the post-2015 institutional reform goals. I think these are all important proposals which all have to be taken seriously because they address important issues and problems. But then they also raise further questions. Given we could realize these taxes, what should be done with this money? I guess we would be faced with the same problems we faced now in the traditional development aid business. How could things be improved and poverty eradicated? Questions are to be asked like, is it all about a certain percentage of the GDP that is available as investment money? Is it mainly about building a local infrastructures, roads, electricity, water? Is it mainly about education? Is it mainly about establishing property rights, as has been claimed? Is it mainly about changing the international economic order? Or even, is it all about a piecemeal approach, let's see what works and then do it? Why should we ask this question? Why do we have to ask this question? Now, as we all know, aid can help, but it can also be useless. And it's not just that it can be useless. I think in some cases, if carried out carelessly, also a word used by Thomas, it might even have harmful effects. The literature on the so-called aid business or aid industry contains many stories of how aid went wrong. Aid funds can be shifted by recipient governments to build up its military. To give you an example, pumping aid money into an economy can increase price inflation for basic goods. Donations can wipe out domestic manufacturing and other things more. Thomas Pogge addresses the question of what the right measures are that have to be taken to eradicate poverty. He's not just talking about raising various taxes. He presents additional measures which should be taken. For instance, to abolish the trade barriers, which is the protection particularly for agricultural product, I take. Again, I fully agree with him. I think trade barriers should go. But this measure raises again further questions. Abolishing trade barriers might be helpful for some countries which have agricultural products to export. The classic case is cotton, in the case, for instance, of Mali and Burkina Faso. They produce cotton and are not able to export it on the European market and the American, particularly on the American market. And economists think it would make a difference of, say, 1% increase of the GDP growth per year if they could. That might be helpful for countries of that kind, but not for others such as, and I'm always talking about the least developed countries, that is mainly about African countries, it wouldn't matter to countries like the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Angola, where no agricultural goods are available for export, and no industrial products also as well. By the way, there are further questions to be asked if we talk about abolishing the trade barriers. Should the trade barriers only be abolished unilaterally? That is, should least developed countries have access to the international agricultural market, for instance, but the rich countries not to their markets? Should they be, the least developed countries, favored over countries which are probably not rich, but do not belong to the least developed countries? So, for instance, what I have in mind is Asian countries which are actually producing growth and are economically of a great danger to certain least developed countries with regard, for instance, to agricultural production. In addition, some of these countries are resource-rich countries, most of them governed by, as Thomas puts it, unrepresentative rulers. And I think that's right. They're at least governed by rulers which are not representative of majorities. They're representative probably of minorities or certain groups within the society. They normally have a certain backing in society because otherwise they wouldn't survive for a very long time. But they have no, say, legitimate backing. I agree with that. Companies dealing with such rulers buying natural resources should be taxed, Thomas proposes. And again, I fully agree. At least I think there is indeed a problem to be solved here, which has nothing to do with trade barriers, but with something else. To make the problem more visible, I give an example. Beyond getting any additional money from a natural resource tax or a tax which would come from the taxes raised on oil companies, the state of Angola, the second biggest oil producer on the African continent, gets approximately $5 billion a year, and it's the state, not the companies, in oil revenues, without having effects we could approve of. The growth of Angola produces benefits for only a handful of its people. That's just one example. It's not the only case. There are other cases. The same is true, for instance, of Equatorial Guinea, with one of the highest GDP growth rates in the last years in the world, again due to its oil revenues. And the funny thing is, well, it's not funny, it's a very sad thing, is that a country which gets that, which is basically quite rich, and I'm talking about the money they already get, not they will get when the tax system has introduced Thomas proposes. The sad thing is that there is a huge gap between, a huge inequality in these countries. And in Angola, people, 75% of the population lives in extreme poverty. 75 or 80% at least, a huge percentage of the population. But then you might say we should probably stop dealing with the state of Angola. That means with the Angolan government. They shouldn't be able to sell their products anymore and sanction those who do actually deal with them. I mean, those companies that are involved in this business. I think that might be, at first sight, a sensible proposal, but in the world we live in, I'm absolutely sure that the Chinese companies and other companies from Indonesia and Malaysia, already present on a massive scale on the African continent, would be very happy to step in and to take over the whole African market. But then, of course, we probably need to put political pressure on these regimes to get them to change the way they deal with the revenues of the resources. But I'm actually not able to solve that problem. I just want to indicate that I think effective aid helping these people concerned living in this country is not just about raising a tax on oil companies. To avoid misunderstanding here, the difficulties we are facing in making extreme poverty history leaves our obligation to help absolutely unchanged. Further questions, that's the only thing I want to tell you, have to be answered. I think the main question, what is good aid? Again, what are the principles we should follow? Is it about, again, the question I asked at the beginning, is it about what? Is it about education? Is it about changing institutional structures? Is it about changing the political systems of this country? Or what is it about? And then I think in addition to all that main question, there is also the question, Is it all about cost effectiveness? Or should we give priority to the worst of, say, weighing the interests and needs of the worst of more than the interests of those less worse off? Then there is the question of accountability. Should the helpers also be held accountable for their mistakes? Should aid be organized by a central human development fund, which would also be in charge of certain licenses? These questions need to be answered to make sure that things are done properly. We should not just follow an impulse. This would not just be naive, it would at the same time be, I think, irresponsible and dangerous. Aid is a complex business. This wonderful initiative you started, Giving What We Can, might hopefully be an important step in bringing extreme poverty to an end. In order to accomplish this, we need to think about good aid. We need to do this to make sure that aid is not just a matter of good intentions, but good deeds. Thank you.
Would you like to comment, Professor Hoey?
Yeah, I thought this was very helpful, and thank you very much for your remarks. So I would stress in response to this complexity maybe two things. One is that I would not emphasize aid as much, so I don't think the humanitarian fund should be thought of as first and foremost an aid fund that channels money to the poor, but it should be seen more as a structural reform that has a tremendous effect, not in the first instance through the particular payments that it makes, the particular things that it does in particular countries, in particular contexts, but through the standing rules under which it operates. And that is what I think is wrong with much of the current aid business as it now is, which you rightly, I think, gave some examples of. That aid is fundamentally political now, so that those who give aid, the so-called donors, are constantly thinking about all the various different advantages that they might want to get out by giving aid to this person or that person. It's not by coincidence that the vast majority of aid really benefits firms in the donor country who are exporting something into the poor countries, or they benefit some elites in the developing countries that are capable of reciprocation. What we need to establish is firm standing rules that have incentive effects, both deterrent effects on certain kinds of behavior, where you say governments that behave in certain ways will not be eligible for any money from the Humanitarian Development Fund. That money will then be given to civil society organizations in that country, or it may be given to poor people or governments in other poor countries, which really make that money more effective. And so the whole thing, if it's rule-governed and multilateral, so that you have a whole bunch of governments paying into the same pool, and then you have the primary objective of the entire fund. The whole fund is managed for maximum impact. Impact coming not just from the payments, but coming from the standing rules under which the fund is operating. You would get much, much better results than if you had a lot of different governments giving bilateral aid, always thinking short-term, always thinking strategically in terms of their other policy objectives, keeping certain governments friendly, keeping certain local firms friendly, and so on. So that's where I see the biggest change in how we can get from the existing haphazard aid system to something more systematic, more rule-governed, where the incentive effects would play a much larger role.
Any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for your presentations. My question would be, I didn't realize if there is today some kind of a subject behind all this policy or developments, these inequality spirals, you called it. It seemed to be more or less a result of some different, perhaps rich people or rich companies, and in the end it happens like this. But my question is, isn't there, I would say the traditional Marxist approach was, there is clearly a concept and an ideology behind what we would like to do or what they like to do and what should be done. And in your analysis, I have much more the impression it is not so clearly said what happens perhaps in the third world countries and what they should perhaps do. It's more or less an approach of the first world countries. I agree very much what you were telling, but I missed a little bit how perhaps your position is related to this perhaps old-fashioned approach a lot of people had in the 70s and in the 80s.
Yeah, so I must say I'm not much of a Marxist when it comes to explaining historical processes. So I think that history is much more haphazard, much more contingent and fragile than Marx would have thought. He, following Hegel, thought that history is essentially progressing in a group. There are little aberrations, but basically things will go back into the preordained path. So what I think is that there were great historical opportunities which we missed. So I think the 70s were a great opportunity where we had young people highly politicized and so on. And then relatively quickly, starting with the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union and then followed, of course, by Reagan, Thatcher and so on, we had a catastrophic shift towards the elites, towards the corporate elites in particular, and income inequality started shooting up in some of the rich countries and so on. None of this had to happen as far as I can see. I think all of this was something that was bad organization on the part of the more progressive movements and very good, really admirably good organization on the part of corporations and so on. Also then this enormous vacuum that happened after the Soviet Union collapsed was a vacuum where the big corporations were extremely well organized in filling it. Right? So they immediately said, okay, we have to nail this down. We have to get the World Trade Organization and bring the whole world under a unified trading regime. And in that trading regime, we have to especially protect intellectual property rights because that is the feudalism of the future. In the old days, it was land ownership that secured you a large share of the social product if you could pretend to be the landowner. But in the future, it's going to be the knowledge owners going to get a large share of the collectively produced product. And that's what they did. The Americans are now, the United States is now making more money on exporting intellectual property, i.e. on royalties that are coming in, than they are making on the entire agricultural produce. So it's really quite dramatic. And this was, again, contingent. You had 4 different industries getting together. The pharmaceutical industry, the agribusinesses, the entertainment industry, and the software people. They got together, they hammered it out, and once they had an agreement, they took it to Washington and said, Clinton, you have to get us this. We want this as part of the WTO. And faced with these 4 very important industries, Clinton said, okay, fine, I get you this. And so he took that to the WTO, the Uruguay round, where this was negotiated, and we were all essentially sleeping, right? There was some opposition in 2001, Seattle and so on, but at the time when the TRIPS agreement and the WTO agreement were concluded, there was very little understanding of what was going on, and certainly very little resistance as this big new city, this big new architecture of global rules was built. So I don't see any big ideology, any big conspiracy. I see a lot of powerful agents, each one working intelligently towards maximizing their share, collaborating with one another where they can, and a lot of intelligent but politically hapless people on the progressive side of things who essentially miss the boat.
All right, well, I'm sure there's quite a few more questions, but we now have to move on to the second part of our presentation. And there's an opera being prepared for all of us afterwards by the KGS, this is Beacon Society. So you are more than welcome to continue this discussion over the opera. But let's thank our speakers once again.
we clearly have these two citizen responsibilities that Professor Pogge mentioned.
And now I'm going to invite two of our team members, Joanna and Adriano, to tell us exactly what this organization, Giving What We Can, is, and then what the Swiss chapter aims to achieve.
And finally, how all of you guys can get involved if you're interested in what you heard today. So, Adriana?
Thank you.
Do you want the lights or is it okay?
Okay, das hier. Da unten. Ja.
Okay, still working?
Good. So now let me more concretely introduce this organization that we're not founding the organization, we're founding the Swiss chapter here today, Giving What We Can. It is an initiative that was founded in the year 2009 in Oxford, and more concretely by the Oxford philosopher Toby Ord. And its purpose is precisely to meet, especially also the second duty that Thomas Pogge mentioned that we have as individuals, as individual moral agents, and especially also as citizens. It's about establishing a culture of, as Thomas Pogge put it, careful giving, with an emphasis also on the measurement of the success. That is, are we actually helping people, or are we just basically feeling good about having done something or believing that we have done something? So we are about having impact and measuring our success. We've heard a very interesting talk about Thomas Pogge's approach. Thomas Pogge is, as was mentioned, one of the world-renowned members and supporters of Giving What We Can, but he's not the only one. And unsurprisingly, the Princeton philosopher Peter Singer is among them as well. And his philosophical ethical approach is quite different, but what I find most interesting is that on this very question, on the goal or the mission of giving what we can, almost all ethical theories seem to converge. But let me say a few words on Peter Singer's approach. He's, among other things, famous for his drowning child thought experiment. So you can see here the drowning child, and then down there Peter Singer having fun playing Spider-Man. And although he makes it very clear in his original thought experiment that the child is drowning in a shallow pond, he insisted to go to more dramatic waters for this shot. But let's come back to the thought experiment. So imagine that you come by a shallow pond and you see that a child is drowning in that pond. And you also realize that you're the only person there with the capacity to save that child. And then I think most people wouldn't hesitate to save the child and also to accept a pretty strong moral obligation to do so, even when there are certain costs to that action. So for instance, you might ruin your newly bought expensive shoes or clothes. So for instance, you'd have to pay maybe a few $100s in order to save that child if you don't get any compensation. And still, I guess most people would agree that there would still be an ethical obligation to do so. So as you see, that's quite different from Thomas Pogge's approach, who focuses more on compensation. This approach is focused more on direct positive duties to aid. And what I also find pretty convincing is that we don't have to follow Peter Singer's overall argument or overall utilitarian theory. I mean, we don't have to accept that there are really far-reaching and extreme positive duty to help anyone that we can to the best of our abilities, but we simply have to accept that in really unfortunate and difficult circumstances, maybe in circumstances where other people are living in circumstances that violate their dignity, for instance, if we can help them at no or at a trivial cost to ourselves, then we should do so, and maybe unconditionally do so. So what are Giving What We Can goals, more concretely? the heart of the organization is the Pledge of Giving, and its purpose is to encourage people to give 10% or more of their income to the most cost-effective charities, aid projects, also structural measures that they can find. And so, as I said, I mean, there are different ethical arguments supporting this, different ethical approaches converging on that same goal. So that's the ethical part. And the empirical core, I would say, is the idea of cost effectiveness and of charity evaluation and charity research. So we want to measure our success, we want to make sure that we are actually helping people. And more broadly, of course, we also want to establish a culture of giving. It's not about bragging that we do give, but we aim to establish, so to say, a new social norm. It's just a normal thing that you do. You give 10%, for instance. You recognize that other people are in severe need, that you can help them, at least a bit, at a trivial cost to yourself, and so you do it. More concretely as to the pledge, as I said, Giving What We Can members pledge to donate 10% of their income to the charities that they believe will most effectively help alleviate suffering in the developing world. It's also important to stress that this pledge is, of course, not legally binding. It is to be understood rather as the expression of a personal and maybe semi-public commitment that you make, and it, of course, defines Giving What We Can membership. There's also the option for students to start donating just 1% and increase the amount later on, but of course we encourage students also to start right away with 10%. Up until now, more than $95 million have been pledged by the approximately 250 current members of Giving What We Can, and that figure, of course, is to be understood in terms of the expected lifetime earnings of Giving What We Can members. Cost effectiveness, as I said, that's probably the empirical core of the organization. Giving What We Can conducts charity research, scientific charity research, and collaborates with other organizations that do the same thing, such as GiveWell, givewell.org. I highly recommend you to check out this website, this science-based project of charity evaluation. And of course, Giving What We Can also takes important data from the World Health Organization and other organizations that provide them. To give you an example of why cost effectiveness is really extremely important, if we take the field of HIV or AIDS programs, there are several different projects or initiatives that we could support. Some initiatives, for instance, focus on the prevention of the mother-to-child infection. And if we calculate the numbers there very roughly, we find that we can prevent one mother-to-child infection for about $150 to $300. If we compare that to other projects focused on medical treatment after the infection has occurred, we find that 1 year of treatment costs between $130 to $550. And so that's really a huge gap between those two initiatives working in the same field, aiming at the same goal, so to say. And of course it would be best if we could do both at the same time, if there wasn't a conflict between prevention and treatment. But if we do have finite and limited resources, if, for instance, we decide to donate 10% of our limited income, then we have to make these hard decisions. And it seems that if we want to achieve our altruistic, our ethical goals most effectively, that is, if we want to help people the most, and maybe the greatest number of people also, then we'd have to opt for the prevention program in this case, because it seems to dominate the other program by orders of magnitude. And the general point is really, if you look at the results of this charity research, you find that, for instance, considering sanitary programs undertaken in developing countries, the effectiveness difference can reach a factor of 1,000. So we're really talking orders of magnitude. And so it's very important if you want to donate something, and if it's not just about yourself feeling better afterwards, if you want to be sure that you're actually helping people, then it's essential to take this information into account when donating. What are our top charities? You can see them here. These are our current top 3 recommendations. And it's important to mention that there is a continuous re-examination and re-evaluation of these recommendations going on, of course, because new data is coming in all the time. Then there's also always the question whether there is room for more funding in the recommended organizations, and depending on these parameters, those recommendations might change in the future. It's also important to emphasize that, of course, these are the Giving What We Can current recommendations, but members are free to choose their charities. And I guess I've mentioned it already, but Giving What We Can is not a charity itself, so you don't give any money to Giving What We Can, you give it to the organizations that you choose to support directly. And if you believe that you have good empirical evidence for some other organization being even more effective, or for instance if you believe that, as Thomas Pogge explained, I mean, if political action is always very risky, but if you believe that the chances of success there are high enough and that the results could be really high leverage, then you might have good empirical grounds for giving your 10% to some organization, political organization, lobbying for structural change, for instance. So that's all possible within the Giving What We Can scheme. It's basically just to encourage people really to think carefully about where to give, to collect empirical data to the best of their abilities, and then give the money accordingly. A few sentences on our recommendations, so you can see what they are about more concretely. That's what you can find on Giving What We Can website, where they present the evaluation of the Against Malaria Foundation. They say delivering insecticide-treated nets is a proven program with high cost effectiveness and a strong track record. Over 1 million people die of malaria each year. Insecticide-treated nets can prevent these deaths at about $1,600 per person, and it only costs about $5 per net delivered. The Against Malaria Foundation has unusually low costs and unusually strong monitoring and evaluation of their programs. So, I mean, I've looked into this data, and it seems to be really robust and scientifically solid. And if we go by these numbers, and for instance, suppose you donate $500 a month, then you can expect to really save a person's life every 3 months. Deworm the World, another of our top recommended charities. Deworm the World is about so-called neglected tropical diseases, parasitic worms and so on. And it seems to be highly cost effective as well. Over 600 million school-aged children are at risk of being infected with parasitic worms. These infections are chronic and widespread, harming children's health and development and limiting their participation in school. School-based deworming is universally recognized as a safe, simple and cost-effective solution. The benefits of school-based deworming are both immediate and enduring. Regular treatment can reduce school absenteeism by 25% and increase adult earnings by over 20% at a cost of less than 50 US cents per child per year. And so that seems to be a really cost-effective intervention. And what was important also for me personally is to realize the opportunity costs in terms of a potential support of Deworm the World that I could give of my spending on other goods. So I mean, let's take an analogy. If I buy a new pair of shoes for $100 or something, then the opportunity costs seem to be 200 deworming treatments. And of course some people have also thought up a new currency. We could talk of a deworming currency and then say, well, the pair of shoes, as a matter of fact, costs 200 deworming treatments. Now, that's not to say that it's morally illegitimate to buy a new pair of shoes. It's just, first of all, a fact. I guess it's important to realize that it is indeed a fact. If we trust these numbers, and they seem to be scientifically trustworthy, then whenever we spend an amount of money on some goods, they have opportunity costs. And this might be relevant ethically, but I have not argued it out. I haven't argued out all the ethical questions here. It's just this empirical fact that it might be highly relevant to the ethical overall examination. Okay, and let me end with a quote by Peter Singer. I mean, what's the upshot, the conclusion of all this? Singer says, "It is inspiring to think that we can each save tens or even hundreds of lives just by donating 10% of our income to the most cost-effective charities. Anyone who takes global poverty seriously should join giving what we can. And what was most convincing, I think, for me personally, is that with these 10%, if you think about it, well, first you think, well, that's a substantial amount, that's a real cost. But then I discovered, for instance, psychological studies that seem to show that donations tend to make the donors themselves happier as well. So altruistic spending seems to be, also in prudential and egoistic terms, maybe one of the best forms of spending. And if you look at it this way, and also, I mean, if we consider how rich we really are, I mean, we are the richest people who ever lived on this planet. And if we give away 10%, we will still be among the very richest people who have ever lived. And if we further take into account those psychological studies, then what we have is we can make an enormous difference, maybe to the lives of hundreds of people, and alleviate an enormous amount of suffering. And depending on my actions, depending on what I do, those people will either live or die. And on the other hand, what is at stake for me? Basically nothing. Basically nothing. So it seems like we can save hundreds of lives at basically no cost to ourselves. And to me personally, that was kind of an ethical no-brainer, and I thought, yes, seems like a good project, I will support it, and I'm glad that we're so many people here today who support this initiative too. And with that, I want to hand over now to my colleague Joanna, who will talk more concretely about the Swiss chapter that we're founding today.
Thanks, Juliana. So, first of all, I would like to comment that I see a lot of familiar faces here, so that's very good. I really appreciate that. But also I can see a lot of non-familiar faces. That is also even better, because we have been preparing this event for a long time, and yeah, we have put a lot of effort, and just seeing you all here just make us very happy. So with this, I would like to explain briefly what we do in our chapter, in the Giving What We Can Switzerland chapter. And before that, I would like to just tell a story, how everything started. So I study at the Institute of Neuroinformatics, and I'm a very good friend of Elena. And yeah, she had done her undergrad before in Oxford, and is there where she discovered the organization Giving What We Can. So we were having lunch together one day, and she told me that she had joined an initiative that partly was supported by Giving What We Can, and it's called Living Below the Line. So Living Below the Line was an initiative that consists of, for 1 week, living below the extreme poverty line. And that means spending per day in food less than 2.8 Swiss francs in food. So yeah, I decided to join together with my sister that is there too. And yeah, it was an amazing experience. It was hard, but I really recommend everyone to try sometime something like that. And well, apart of that, I cannot eat polenta anymore because we were having it every day. So yeah, so with this. After joining this initiative, so I got to know Giving What We Can, and I really like their ideas, and especially because personally, before I was aware of this spiral of inequalities that Thomas Pogge mentioned, and I thought we should do something about it, and we should change something because it's not fair. So that's why I also decided to take the pledge and collaborate with my money to alleviate suffering for those that are in most need. But I also wanted to do something more actively, and that's why I also decided to join the local chapter of Giving What We Can. And we started with this idea of creating this local chapter, and we talked with people in Oxford to present our idea, to founding here the chapter, and then we found out for our great surprise that other people in Switzerland were having the same idea at the same time. So for that, people in Basel and in Bern, and also in Geneva. So we contacted them, and yeah, we decided to team up and to make together this Giving What We Can Switzerland chapter. So with this, I just would like to briefly explain what we do. Basically, we organize events in order to publicize the organization here in Switzerland, just to make people aware of what we do, why this is important, and just to encourage everyone to join. And for that, we organize events, for example, the one that we did today, inviting experts who can talk about poverty and effective ways of eradicating it. And we also are planning to invite, for example, Rob Maher, the president of Against Malaria Foundation, that, if you remember, is one of the top charities recommended. So he's coming on December 17th, and if you have, he's going to talk both in Zurich and in Basel. And if you want to take the event, we're going to come to the event and ask questions. You wonder how such an effective and transparent organization works. So you should join and ask him all the questions that you may have. And we're also planning to do a couple of meetings, one in Basel and another in Zurich on November 8th and November 15th. And it's basically to welcome all the people that may want to join us and to review together all the criteria, all the charity evaluation criteria that Adriano has mentioned before, to see how it works, and also to share inputs and see together, figure out to which organization we think is better to donate. And oh yeah, I forgot. So we have distributed some questionnaires, and so you can put your give us your email address, and if you want to get closer to our chapter, want to collaborate, or simply get information about, for example, these events that we are planning or further events. So please fill it, and also we expect some positive feedback from your part. And yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you, John. So, as Joanna mentioned, you don't have to commit to pledging 10% or 1% to join us. We welcome any help, and if you want to see more people and what your input is. And so I would really encourage you to come on November 15th to welcome meeting, just to support us and to hear more. So because pledging to give 10% is quite a big thing at first. So it's not a decision that's to be taken lightly, right? And some of our members have thought long and hard about this, and have decided to commit themselves to donate 10% of their income from now until the day that they retire to charities that they feel will be most effective at alleviating poverty and improving health in the developing world. So, because Giving What We Can is also about taking a public stand about the moral imperative of giving, our members have decided to make the pledge public before you now. So if I can invite those guys who've decided to pledge up here right now, we have forms for them, and if each one of you says 2 sentences about why you're pledging to donate, that would be good. So.
It takes a bit of courage to take this pledge in public, but so kind of what I'm doing is I'm saying now, promising kind of that for the rest of my life I'll live with 90% of my income maximally. And when I think about these 90%, I must say that I see no way how I could miss something by living with at most 90%. I feel that my life is full of gifts. I feel like I'm extremely blessed by the educational opportunities I had, by the travels I could make, by the financial stability I live with, I have true friends who appreciate me, and so, I mean, there's a genuine gratefulness, and there's no reason I see why I couldn't pass on at least a small part, and so why am I taking the pledge? Yeah, there is this genuine urge to want to pass something on, but then it gets lost in everyday life. I have a genuine fear that if I look back when I'm 70, I will not really have done something, and so kind of by taking a pledge now, what I'm doing is I have a minimal guarantee that I will have play at least a small part in poverty eradication.
I study clinical medicine, and I always thought medicine was fascinating. Like its fundamentals, natural sciences are challenging in many ways, and even more I need technical and practical skills, and maybe most important, social skills. And all these disciplines meet at one point the human, which was really interesting to me. But there's another reason that made me choose clinical medicine as my field of study. I always wanted to do at least some good in this world. I think doctors are considered the most ethical people of our society. So I thought, well, perfect.
A human is supposed to be the most ethical, not the profession, but like the service you do.
Yeah. I think that's a perception in our society. Maybe I'm wrong, but I guess people think so. And I thought, well, perfect, I'm going to study clinical medicine and I'll enjoy all of the advantages I mentioned. Plus, I have the world-changing benefit. And yeah, now I'm in the 4th year and quite disenchanted, to be honest. I've been asking myself, what would have happened if I had chosen to study something else? In Switzerland, you have to pass a test to get one of the limited university places for medicine. And if I had studied economics, for example, someone else would have taken my place. And, well, maybe I'm a bit better than him, but maybe not. And to make it even worse, if one tries to estimate the impact that doctors have in our society, measured maybe in human lives saved, the number is quite small compared to the perception that I was noticing in our society. So I'm not only interested in feeling good, I want to see results, I want to make a difference. And this is why I pledge today to give a small fraction of my income, of my lifetime income, to charity. And I hope I will make a difference that way. I will give 20% of my lifetime income to the most cost-effective charities. Thank you.
Well, I'm Miriam Roser. I'm a nursing scientist, and I think everything has been said about good reasons to do it, to sign the pledge. I do not have to add anything more.
Hi, my name is Lucius, and I've decided to give 10% of my future income.
My name is Rai, you are a sister, as you may have noticed. And I'm here because I believe that together we can make a change for real. We can create this new culture of giving. And right now, I'm going to read this pledge to give, which we all together are going to sign. So, the pledge to give. I recognize that I can use part of my income to do a significant amount of good in the developing world. Since I can live well enough on a small income, I pledge that from today until the day I retire, I shall give at least 10% of what I earn to whichever organizations can most effectively use it to fight poverty in the developing world. I make this pledge freely, openly, and without regret.
Go for it, guys. All right. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us in this. And there's an opera being prepared afterwards. If you have any questions for us, we're easy to find, red ribbons, so please come and talk to us. There's also a chance to join us for dinner at Tibbetts if you would like to continue the discussion with Professor Pogge. So, sorry? So again, come talk to us if you would like to do that. And a final thank you to the Ethics Center of the University who made this event possible for us and helped us organize. And with that, I think I might officially be able to open the chapter. We have a red ribbon here, which we would like to cut. So, everyone gonna, no? All right, 3, 2, oh!